Hi, everybody. So remember that this week is a little unusual. The case study for this week was actually started last week with my lecture on chapter 25. So, because the 1960s is such an important kind of pivotal moment, watershed, whatever you want to call it, I have a hard time covering it in 1 week. So, we started chapter 25 last week. And then this week, we continued on with two course reader articles to help kind of supplement and fill out our understanding of the 1960s. So I encourage you to go back, review chapter 25, my thesis for the case study, and then you'll remember why I'm continuing to talk so extensively about Vietnam, which was the lecture for the first part of this week. And then today, talking more extensively about Gloria Steinem and second wave feminism. Remember, all of these tied back to primary sources that you read and then responded to a discussion post last week. So just a review there. When I asked you to read Gloria Steinem's essay, If Men Can Menstruate, you all had some interesting posts, and I shared some of those back with the chapter 25 video. So go back and review those as well. Part of the reason I chose this image of Gloria Steinem, she's on the left, and that's Dorothy Hughes on the right, is because a couple of years ago, both these women are still alive, and they did a new photo shoot of them wearing the same clothes and in the same positions. It's really awesome. Look it up online. It's one of my favorite images to this day. So I wanted to remind you of Ramsey's opinion about the essay If Men Can Menstruate, because I feel like it got to something really significant. And remember, I left it as a big question mark at the end of that lecture in chapter 25. And I said, we'll finish it later. I think maybe the of course, read our article you read for today about disco is going to help illuminate a number of things, and it's useful to talk about them together. So remember, some of you were like, yeah, she's a man hater. I really didn't like this essay. Some of you were like, oh my God, this was hilarious. It's super effective, right? Like really different opinions. And I felt like Ramsey kind of very succinctly got to a question I think it's probably lingering for a lot of us, but didn't just rise to the surface. So Ramsey says, the essay feels like ranting. I feel like there's more societal bias about gender roles that has been taking place throughout all of history than what the switching of reproductive organs could possibly change. And then Ramsey's like, okay, so let's say we do change them. Then what defines a male from a female anymore? We might just be where we are now, still just in opposite positions. So please think on that. Ramsey's getting to something significant, I think maybe without even understanding where he's headed there. Okay, so before I illuminate this really important thing about Gloria Steinem that I think all of us missed is I have to explain what they're reacting against. You can't just jump into second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s out of context. So what are they responding against? One way of doing this is to give you a quick taste of what kind of mainstream psychology said about women and gender roles prior to second wave feminism. So this would have been just like the post World War II period, the time period where Gloria Steinem was born and raised. So this is the kind of stuff she would have soaked up as a young girl and a teenager. And this is what she's reacting against, her along with second wave feminism. So, I'm really using her as an example. And of course, you can't reduce all of second wave feminism to her. So this is a book by two psychologists called The Modern Woman, The Lost Sex. And think of it as like a pop psychology book. This would have, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And it really identifies kind of what mainstream status quo's ideas are about women and gender roles. So these are kind of paraphrases that I've pulled out from throughout the book. And at the very end, there's a full quotation. So one of the main points they try to make is that the traditional home sphere is the social extension of the mother's womb. That's a direct quote there. So think about that, what that means. It's that like your gender role is tied to your biology. Your womb determines that your place is in the home. Secondly, they said women must return to the traditional home sphere in order to reclaim their inner balance and to reduce the level of hostility in the world. So remember, this is written right after World War II, where women had left the home sphere, and people are kind of in a panic about that. So one of the arguments is you have to go back to the home. Otherwise, you're going to be crazy. You're going to lose your inner balance, and you're going to increase the level of hostility in the world. Again, remember, these are two psychologists arguing this, one of whom is a woman. They went on to theorize that virtually all social problems are the products of neuroses. Most neuroses originate in the home. There go. Women are primarily responsible for the home and for child rearing. Thus, women are the cause of most neuroses and social problems. Any of you taking a logic class right now will have a lot of fun with that one. I hope you're starting to notice the theme here. They then went on to claim that feminism is a deep illness rooted in penis envy, and that the essence of the true female nature and sexuality is in motherhood. So again, I want you to notice the essentialism here, that like essentially, like at the root in their biology, in a way that they can't even help, women are tied to the home and being mothers. Like there's no choice there. That's determined from the moment you're born as a woman. So then this is one of my favorite quotes from the book. They said, this is kind of like a summary of many of their points. They said, the rule is this: the less a woman's desire to have children and the greater her desire to emulate the male in seeking a sense of personal value by objective exploit. So let me just pause there. I know that's like a mouthful. So what they're, in kind of like common words, they're saying, if a woman doesn't want to have children and instead she wants to go out and like have a sense of personal identity by getting a job and doing something else in the outside world, said if she does that, the less will be her enjoyment of the sex act and the greater her general neuroticism. So there you have it. That's the 1950s for you all. This is what second wave feminists were responding against. So it's a kind of interesting reminder in context, right? So let's say you were Gloria Steinem, born and raised in this. Your mom tries to get you to read this book as a young girl, and you're like, I don't know about this. In fact, no. Like, how would you respond? Like, what kind of approach? Like, what kind of argument would you use? Well, what you see argued here in this book, The Lost Sex, is this assumption, and this like goes back for centuries in many kinds of Western culture and definitely American culture, that your biological sex is the same thing as your gender. They can be spoken about interchangeably. And in fact, the biological sex you're born with determines your gender. So gender is behavior, personality, those kinds of things. Sex would be your physical biology. And this is what second wave feminism started to question, because again, as you saw in this book, there's this, notion that like, well, because of your sexual biology, you have to do this. It creates certain like essential gender roles. And second wave feminists pushed back against that. And they said, no, sex doesn't equal gender. And sometimes you can talk about sex versus gender, and that it's a kind of fluid thing. So they really try to undo that kind of binary, both sexual and gendered system. And so again, this is like, I hesitate to leave it here as sex versus gender, but they really tried to separate the two. And they tried to say, no, like your physical biology doesn't determine your gender. Gender is often culturally constructed. It can be a choice by people. And these two things aren't inherently linked. Sex does not equal gender. So keep that in mind. So coming back to Ramsey's point, he's like, like, what is she saying? Like, would you not be able to tell a difference between men and women? Well, actually, that's kind of what she's going for in some ways. I really want you to think about how, or I'm sorry, I don't want you to look at that yet. I want you to think about what happens when you start to think about gender as something culturally constructed and a choice that's not determined by your biology. And so for Gloria Steinem, what she's trying to get us to do in that essay, and I totally get if some of you are like, that's not my style of humor. It's not effective on me. That's fine. But I want you to know what she's actually attempting to do, whether it was effective for you or not. What she's trying to show, again, is that women, in terms of our gendered behavior, have been socialized into believing that anything about our biology is a liability. It makes us weaker. And so what she's doing is she's flipping the scenario there, and she's saying, and furthermore, guess what? Men have been socialized to believe that anything about their biology makes them naturally superior. Anything about their body is an asset. In other words, like there's nothing essential about what your biology means in terms of gender behavior. It's about what you're socialized into believing it means. Is that helpful? I hope that that's a really useful clarification. Go back, pause the video, repeat that again if you need to. So that's why I would argue, yeah, Ramsey, she really is trying to upend everything here. And this is, again, not Steinem. This is kind of second wave feminism in general. So I am not comfortable at all just saying like Steinem can stand in for second wave feminism because, she's a white lady born into kind of middle class privilege, and she can't speak for all women of that period who called themselves feminists. So I think we also have to look at other groups. There's a group of Black lesbian feminists from this time period that formed a group they called the CRC, Combahee River Collective. I really urge you guys to go pick up some of their writing. They love to write. If you were into Students for a Democratic Society, remember their like manifesto. I had you read part of it, and some of you are like, oh, the language. Go read the Combahee River Collective. I think you might like them. So a group of Black feminist lesbians. They were in Boston, and their manifesto is what you see here, at least just a short part of it. And I include them as yet another reminder of kind of the intersections of the fight during this period in terms of both anti-racism and anti-woman ideas. So I ask y'all, like, is Gloria Steinem a man hater? I really want to caution you guys against falling into the trap of thinking about feminism that way. That was an accusation made by people that were threatened by what they were doing, but in no way were they man haters. And let's just look at Combahee River Collective as an example of why. So in part of their manifesto, they said, we have a great deal of criticism and loathing for what men have been socialized to be in this society. So again, you hear this lingo about not essentially who they are, but what they're socialized, right? So their gender is what they're socialized into. And they say, we have loathing for that. We loathe what they support, how they act, and how they oppress. But we do not have the misguided notion that it is their maleness per se, i.e. their biological maleness that makes them what they are. As Black women, we find any type of biological determinism a particularly dangerous and reactionary basis upon which to build a politic. I certainly hope I don't have to go into much detail there to remind you guys why Black women would have a really hard time supporting any kind of social politic that is based in the idea of like your biology determines who you can be. So they're like, do we like what men do? No, we in fact loathe it, but it's not because of their like biological maleness. It's what they've been socialized to be. So the gendered aspect. So again, like Steinem, they're trying to get people to disconnect these two notions that like your sex, your biology determines who you are, how you behave. And they're really reminding us this is a part of socialization. It's a part of how our culture teaches us to be as either men or women. And what I really like about the Combahee River Collective is the fact that they're lesbians. And so they, even more than Steinem, start to kind of question the binary here, right? And so it starts to make room for other kinds of identities on a spectrum of sexual identity. So again, questioning the binary nature of how society has framed both sex and gender. So it starts to allow for a proliferation of identities. And I can say over the course of my childhood and then into adulthood, I've seen the results of this. We just started with first LGBT, and then we added Q's and I's and pluses. And it's just so exciting to see the proliferation of ideas about who we can be, our choice of who we can be as people, and that it's not determined by how you're born. So I hope that that's a more exciting way to think about Steinem. And if again, you're like, ooh, she uses language that's just hard, or humor that's not funny, or she uses a kind of binary system that seems to exclude trans people, I get all of those criticisms. But also try to make space for the ways in which she is trying to put a wedge in the existing system, kind of pull it apart and make more space for other kinds of people. So I also want to real quickly talk about, again, we can't just talk about feminism through the eyes of one white woman. It's a very big and diverse movement. And there's, of course, a Mexican-American feminist movement as well called Las Chicanas. So I would love to just like go on and on about the Combahee River Collective and Las Chicanas. But I do have to get to the course reader article today, but I just want to make a quick connection here. And Ellie, I think, was the one that really saw some of the deeper connections between this article and other things that we're talking about. Ellie said, I think that her concluding paragraph, says Gina Chavez, was very interesting and is something I've never thought about before. She mentions that Mexican American men have held onto their macho masculinity because as an oppressed group, it is one of the last things they can hang on to that makes them feel powerful. So this is again where it's important to think about the bigger picture, to not be too focused on any singular group, movement, event at any point in history, to always think about what else is going on at the same time. And this is the quote I think that Ellie is referring to, where Chavez says, you know, I get that because Mexican American men in the larger culture are dehumanized and they're not treated as equals, that they're also going to look for some sign of power. And so she says that's this machismo, this exaggerated assertion of masculinity. And why would they kind of latch onto that? Well, y'all, that's because that kind of machismo is also celebrated in American culture. So it's a way of trying to fit in. So I want you to think about the larger system here. And remember, my case study is really kind of thinking about systematic problems and systematic solutions to systemic issues. And I think this is all a nice interlude and lead into the article that you read for today. So as we start talking about this article, I want you to think if there's any insights that you could translate from maybe Gloria Steinem into this story and vice versa, or maybe Las Chicanas movement. There's lots of interconnections here. All right, so this is a picture of Steve Dahl, the DJ that helped organize the demolition of the disco records. I'm sorry, I have such a hard time keeping a straight face when talking about the story, not because I mean to belittle or make fun of the significance of this story, but there's just so many layers of kind of irony here. And then just the fashion of this time period makes me laugh, like the bell bottoms and the polyester, and there's just a lot going on here. And I tend to laugh when I feel overwhelmed by the significance of things that I'm looking at in history. So this is Steve Dahl. I slotted these images in because one of you talked about how you actually looked up some pictures and videos from this time period. Isn't that's so great about like kind of post World War II history is you start to actually be able to access more pictures and sometimes even videos of these events. So this is when they actually exploded the pile of records, and the police were called in because, apparently that leads to a riot. All right, right? Like, are you all laughing with me too a little bit? Like there's this level of hilarity partly because of the horror of it. Okay, so 2 important questions I want to use to focus the rest of my lecture here. The first one is the question that you all thought about for your discussion post. So that's listed there in case you forgot. And then secondly, another question I want you to address is, how has the history of disco changed? And how was it misremembered by the 1990s? In case any of you haven't seen Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta, you should. You like totally should this weekend go out, find it, watch it. All right. So first, the discussion post. Oops, I'm sorry. Tanner and Alice, I think, came the closest to getting the thing that was hard to capture, honestly, about this. Like many of you were like 99% there in terms of understanding what was going on in the story. But there's like this one missing link. And I think if we think about Gloria Steinem, it might be helpful. But Tanner and Alice like got really, really close. Tanner says, the report that was written by Maureen North about what she observed in the disco bathrooms was very prominent to the overall message of discophobia. She explains, so again, this is the reporter, not the author of this story. The reporter explains that in the ladies' bathroom, there are many hairbrushes and blow dryers provided by the management. And in the men's bathroom, there's a similar setup. I think this is significant because the theme of the bathrooms being the same sort of transferred onto the disco dance floor. I think she focused on the bathrooms because it showed that men and women's grooming rituals were quite similar. And this created the asexual nature of the disco culture. This might have been what prompted fear in people to stay away from disco. In other words, some people may have feared that they would transition into this asexual sexuality if they did participate in disco. Or some might have feared that they would simply not fit in because they were straight and would not make that transition. And then Alice says, bathrooms are a particularly easy target for directing anti-LGBT hate due to their establishing boundaries between male and female. And with it, male and female behavior. Emphasizing the similarities between grooming behaviors of men and women who attend discos promoted the idea of discos as threatening societal norms of being male or female, causing fear to those who believed that such distinct categories of behavior are essential parts of society. I hope this is starting to kind of trigger some relations back to what I was just talking about a few minutes ago. So Tanner and Alice, thank you, kind of different ways of capturing the same point. And then I just wanted to show you one more example of another way to talk about this. This is Cade. Cade says, Maureen North's excerpt about the bathrooms of a Chicago discotheque was significant because it highlighted the gender transgression happening in the men's restroom, at these young men's homes, and at the disco in general. And it connected that to its threat of crossing over to mainstream culture. So this is what I really liked about Cade's response here, is he reminds us, like, the boys and girls that this reporter was observing were straight, just kind of normal, everyday teenagers, young adults. And that's what's threatening about it. So the reporter talks about these 2 boys, Johnny and Ray's occupations. They're typical stadium attendant and hamburger franchise employees, right? Just average kids. Similarly, the young bookkeeper, Yolanda, and her typist girlfriend are threads in mainstream culture via their occupations, and thus their stability in that of other social spheres is threatened by the gender ambiguity being demonstrated by the men in their bathroom. North focused on the bathrooms because these were perceived as clearly separated space of sexual difference, male and female. for synchronous behaviors and attitudes like grooming and attention to appearance to be exhibited in these spaces was interpreted as a threat to American values. The bathrooms were also a focal point because of their connotation with various aspects of, quote, dirtiness. Bathrooms also tied into the nationwide anti-ERA New Right rhetoric. You covered a lot of ground there, Kate. Some of this we will continue to explore in the chapter that we're going to read for next week. But the point here that I really wanted to highlight that no one explicitly said, but like Kate and Alice and Tanner are all like dancing right around it. Here's the problem. Like, this is why people are hysterical. Bathrooms are about biological functions, biology and sex, things that we're born with. And remember, mainstream society is not on board yet with second wave feminism. And mainstream society presumes that your biology determines your gendered behavior. Ergo, if you walk into a men's bathroom where male biological sexual functions happen, the presumption is you'll see them behaving in different gendered ways. If you walk into a women's bathroom where they do womanly biological functions, the assumption is you'll see them behaving in different ways. Is that happening here? No. She's like, I can't tell the difference, right? They're behaving the same. And that's a threat to American values. Okay. So we have to question here in a second, why? Like, why did people find that so threatening? That's really important to consider. But first, I want you to think who this sounds like, right? Like, let's think back to Steinem and second wave feminists. And you might start to understand why people were hysterical about second wave feminism, right? They're also kind of pushing these presumed discrete categories that people had just assume, like, men behave this way, women behave that way. And you can see that separation happen in a bathroom. Like, the bathroom's a one place. Men behave like men, women behave like women. And they weren't. To just kind of remember the tie-ins here with what feminists were really trying to do. And that is to kind of create a kind of new space for thinking about different kinds of gendered behavior, and that it might not be tied to your biology or determined by your sex. Okay. So I want us to think about, like, why do people care? And I know on some level you're like, well, it's against society. It's against presumed older traditional values, but let's pick this apart just a little bit more. Zach's reminds us that if straight men became effeminate and inseparable in their behavior from gay men with regards to dress, physical appearance, etc., grooming, blow drying their hair, it could destabilize the fragile notions of American masculinity at a time of cultural crisis in the US. During the period when disco died, or specifically was killed, the US was in an economic and cultural crisis. Post-Vietnam War cultural changes, the loss of American political and economic standing, and the changing nature of the American family led many to see a crisis in American masculinity. So again, that's why we can't get too focused, right? Always be zooming out and kind of thinking about the larger context here and what people are reacting to. I hope this is really clear. All of a sudden it occurred to me, I'm not asking you to justify or explain it or excuse it, but simply to understand where that reaction, the hysteria, is coming from. And then Michaela, I think, also really got to the heart of what's going on here. I'll let it speak for itself. Michaela says that, the boy in this story says that there is no, this was a boy out dancing interviewed by the journalist. And the boy says, there's no obligation to find someone to take home. People are just dancing to dance. Men can dance with other men, women dance with other women and men, and women dance together. It seems like lots of straight men had a problem with that. They wanted to dance with straight women and probably had the intention of doing something after. But the women were just there to dance. It could be that the woman noticed that straight men were dancing with a goal, and that is why they didn't want to dance with them. What is Michaela saying? The presumed right of men to simply access women's bodies when they wanted to was being threatened. That felt like a loss. That was really disconcerting. So yeah, lots of layers of different things going on here, right? And next week I will come back to the kind of the anti-ERA and some of the conservative kind of backlash against the counterculture of this time period and tie it in with the larger politics. So this is more than just a story about dancing and music. It really is tied into the larger politics of this time period. I want us to think about the second question that I asked you and move on to how the history of disco changed. In other words, how is it misremembered by the 1990s? So there's the history that you read about here, but that's not really how it was portrayed by the 1990s. I want to take you to a quote that comes from the end of the article, or near the end. And I know by this time we're all tired and we're kind of like, I got the thesis, let's move on. But there is something super important at the end of this article. Gillian Frank says, when disco reemerged in the late 1990s in movies such as Last Days of Disco and Studio 54, in stage musicals like Mamma Mia and Saturday Night Fever, in radio programming and in dance clubs. So I think that's probably where most of you know of disco. That's your association with it. Gillian Frank is arguing when it kind of reemerged and was accepted back into society, its explosive history and subversive sexual possibilities were largely muted. Instead, disco music and its accompanying fashion styles were reintroduced without difficulty as kitsch. So what does that mean? That explosive political potential, the subversive sexual possibilities, is the potential that we could pull from starting to destabilize this gender binary, like the second wave feminists were questioning. And as many of the young people who were excited by disco and going to these dance clubs, they were also in many ways starting to kind of question mainstream culture's ideas around gender. They're pushing some boundaries. It was subversive. And that was too much for America. You'll start again to understand why when you read the next chapter. This backlash should make total sense by the time you finish reading chapter 26. So, disco music's fun. Makes sense. It's going to have a comeback at some point in time. But instead of having a comeback accompanied by the history of it and these kind of subversive possibilities, it's remembered as kitsch. Just, this silly time in the past where people wore bell bottoms and polyester and there's nothing more to it. And, if you watch movies like Mamma Mia and Saturday Night Fever, that's absolutely the impression you get. You don't understand the kind of deeper political context to what happened with disco. So to wrap this all up, I want you to think about how this, interestingly enough, ties back in to my case study where, I started by talking about King. And I talked about the ways in which we've whitewashed King. We've stripped away the radical side of him. And the history that we now have is pretty watered down. And I think that's really interesting to think about the similar process that happened with disco. There's kind of a radical story in the history of disco, but what we get now is just this kind of watered down, it was a period of fun music and bell bottoms. And Martin Luther King's history and legacy similarly kind of de-radicalized, kind of watered it down. So at the end, my case study thesis is, let's remember the true radical potential of these movements. Let's actually know what they were asking for, what they were pushing, what the boundaries were that they were trying to explode. Again, I'm not saying you have to agree with them, but before you disagree, I really want you to know what they were about. So next time you hear someone saying the feminists were man haters, maybe step in and say, well, you don't have to like them. You don't have to agree with them, but they actually weren't men haters. The next time you hear someone, talk about the New Left Students for a Democratic Society and their anti-war protests, and you hear them talk about how, they were kind of effete, snobby, and totally privileged, you can say, yes, they were. And guess what they did with that privilege? They questioned the power structure of the United States government and capitalism, and how that unfairly put the burden of war on poor Black and brown Americans, and then cost the lives of millions of Vietnamese people. Right? So it's a complex story. You don't have to agree with these groups, but I just want you to know what they're actually asking for. And that was systemic change to what they believed were systemic problems in American society. Okay, so I look forward to kind of talking more about this conservative backlash that comes along with chapter 26. And I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.